We fancied ourselves as experts of the paranormal because of the books we have read and the stories we knew, but we'd never really encountered anything highly unusual then. Since our belief and enthusiasm for the unknown were unmet by plausible proofs of any form of solid evidence, the littlest of irregularities that we could spot were more than enough to excite us. Whenever we saw some specks of lights on an overexposed picture or a mere dirt on the lens at the time of a capture, our speculations would lean towards superficial theories as if we were desperate to see what wasn't really there. We went to various places that were claimed as haunted in an attempt to see any form of otherworldly entity. We would assume almost anything as supernatural, such as a faint sound in the shadow or a breeze of cold wind. But at the end of the day, we knew that there was really nothing there, and we were only making things up for the sake of the thrill. After years of faking proofs and pretending, we actually managed to come across the real thing. It was then when we realized that we bit more than we could chew. Despite of the stories we heard and the books we have read, nothing could have possibly prepared us for what we experienced in the abandoned asylum. I was skimming through forums and blog posts in search for a new haunted location. My friends and I had already visited the most popular ones, and we were running out of a place to go. It was then when I saw someone mention about a very old building that was deep in the woods. Based on the photo alone, I could tell that it was indeed in the middle of nowhere. The information about it was questionable at best, but he claimed that the place was haunted and was never explored by any paranormal investigators. He said that the place was probably built during the Renaissance period because of how it looked, and that was all he knew. He claimed that those who wanted to evaluate the property went out running because of the heavy atmosphere inside the building, and nobody ever bothered to see the place since then. I did some research before we went to the mentioned location, but it did seem like the property was yet to receive a proper evaluation. The information available online about it was very little, and there wasn't many photos of it either. However, I found out that the building was some kind of asylum back in the day when people used to incorporate spiritual beliefs and supernatural things with mental illness. I found this particular factor quite intriguing, and so my friends and I had decided to pay this relatively unknown structure a visit. I asked the specific location of the place to the poster in the blog. Willingly gave it to me, but he also warned me about it. He said that this place was not meant for tourists, and we would have nowhere else to go in case anything would have happened. We basically had to camp in there, and it would take at least 5 hours of a drive before we could reach the nearest residence. Despite of his warnings, we were not too worried about it. We thought that it would be just another one of those haunted places we visited before, but we were wrong. We flew our way to the nearest town at the countryside, and we hired a service to bring us to the place as close as he could. During the drive, he told us the story about the old asylum that only the locals knew. He said that the asylum was owned by the monastery, and the patients were treated poorly. While still in the process of learning more about mental illnesses and developing humane therapies, the asylum still accepted the possibility that their patients were possessed by evil spirits. According to the story, this was proven to be true when a particular man under their care happened to be possessed by a demon. He told us the story as if it was a bedtime tale that was meant to scare their children, and it sounded like it was indeed used to scare off uninvited wanderers who often stole antiques from old abandoned properties. Our service driver said that the asylum was shut down because of the bloodbath that happened in there, and they blamed this unfortunate tragedy to a young patient named Albert Benner. Apparently, this young boy had corrupted the minds of the other patients, which ultimately resulted to gruesome murders. The others who were mentally ill were persuaded by the boy until they turned violent towards the staffs and their fellow patients. The asylum was already overwhelmed by the number of people they took in, and there was nothing they could do when they all turned hostile. When a family went there to visit a relative under their care, they saw the dead nuns and priests shackled against the walls and battered to death. There were countless corpses on the floor, while some patients were eating the faces of the other. They said that Albert was watching the horror with a smile on his face. The place was shut down and forsaken, and nobody knew what happened since then. After hearing the horrific history of the asylum, we were rather excited than scared. We have heard a lot of horror stories regarding the haunted places before, but this one easily topped all of them. We were eventually dropped off at the side of the forest, and we had to walk the rest of the way. My friends and I hiked for more than an hour until we arrived at the area, but the location didn't surprise me since asylums back then were often separated from the communities for various reasons. Our expectations were often raised too high after hearing the backstory of a haunted location, which often led to a disappointment. However, the situation at the time was very different. In the middle of nowhere, this antique structure of a large 2-floor building was the only thing in our line of sight aside from the trees. The area was so far and isolated that we could hardly get any signal on our phones. As I eagerly walked inside the old structure with a smile on my face, I abruptly stopped when chills immediately crawled up my spine before I even had the time to look around. Unprotected properties or locations were often full of graffiti on the walls, and yet, I didn't spot a single doodle anywhere, even though the building was left unsupervised all these years. Abandoned properties were often looted as well, but it appeared as if everything inside remained untouched. The seats and the shelves were overran by cobwebs and dust, while the molds and wild grass were already in the process of taking over the floor. There were religious ornaments hanged on the hallway, and the path led us to several rooms of the first floor. With just a short glance inside, I could tell that some of the rooms were containment cells. There were restraining belts on the beds at the center of the rooms, while the others had chains and straps mounted on the walls. Some of the antique tools were left at the tables, and there were even shoes on the floor left behind by whoever was there several decades ago. Disturbingly enough, I also spotted some faint stains of blood on the beddings. Initially, I just wanted to believe the story regardless of its plausibility just to have some thrill for this long trip. But based on what I was seeing, I realized that the horrific history about this place was actually true. My friends and I often fabricated particular events just to entertain our curiosities and paranormal beliefs, but this time around, an inexplicable phenomenon had occurred right before our eyes. My friend Zoe said that her steps seemed heavier ever since we entered the abandoned asylum, and she was also struggling to breathe. I was thinking that she was only saying this to address a superficial presence around us, but I was also feeling the same. There was a heavy atmosphere enveloping the building, and it was the first for me to experience this kind of negative energy. Rather than a simple spook or a strange vibe, the energy was rather unwelcoming and hostile. Without any reason, we could feel that we were unwanted. Meanwhile, our friend Felix, who often claimed about seeing apparitions at the corner of his eyes, was suddenly taken aback. Unlike his fake claims, he was honestly scared when he saw someone running at the hallway from one room to the other. When I saw him growing pale with his eyes opened wide, I knew that he was telling the truth. As a group who fancied themselves as paranormal enthusiasts, we would have went further to search for the ghost that Felix saw. However, all of us had decided to leave right there and then. For the very first time in our ventures for the unknown, we were all genuinely terrified. Aside from the fear of the inexplicable, we all sensed that we were in danger. As we turned away and headed back to the door, Zoe screamed at the top of her lungs while my knees buckled because of what we saw. Right on the hallway, our path was blocked by countless entities glaring at us. Some of their faces were torn. The others had their eyes gouged out, while some were missing their lower jaws. We were already profoundly horrified by their disturbing appearances, and then they started growling and screaming. Overwhelmed by terror, moving a single muscle was unimaginably hard. I desperately moved my legs and took a step forward. As I managed to get back to my senses somehow, Felix and I grabbed Zoe and we powered through the mob of hostile souls. After screaming our hearts out, we were able to get out of the asylum. We didn't even last for 20 minutes until we were driven away by terror. I turned my head as we were walking on our way back to the woods, and I saw a young boy staring at us through the window of the second floor with a sickening grin on his face. The hostile spirits of the dead never left the building, and the young boy at the second floor was no other than Albert Benner.